to talk about the 30 Years' War, the most important conflict in European history until the two world wars of the 20th century. It's a very complex struggle, really hard to identify how and why the war takes twists or turns. So don't worry too much about all the little individual battles. Just keep your eye on why particular countries entered and left the conflict and what the outcomes were overall. So the first phase of religious conflict in Germany ended in 1555. This is when Charles V attempted to suppress the growth of Lutheranism, and he eventually abdicated and divided his empire between the Spanish Habsburgs under his son Philip II and the Austrian Habsburgs under his brother Ferdinand, who became the Holy Roman Emperor. So the formula, which was a compromise settlement, was cuius regio, ius religio, which means his the religion, his the region, his the region, his the religion, which basically meant that it was the acceptance of Lutheran states within parts of the empire and Catholic states in other parts of the empire. No one, however, viewed this as a permanent solution, and both sides geared up to continue to spread their common religion. And what complicated this was the growth of Calvinism, because this was not accounted for in the Peace of Augsburg. So both sides formed alliances amongst themselves, and this is the key thing. They also formed alliances with outside powers. So this ensured that when there was a conflict, it would mean that it would expand to other countries that were allied with either the Protestant or Catholic forces within Germany. So just as a quick review, keep in mind that unlike a lot of other monarchies, the Holy Roman Emperor is an elected position formalized in 1356 with the Golden Bull. So there were 7 electors. 3 of them were church states controlled by the Catholic Church, and 4 of them were territorial entities, larger states. 3 of them by this time were controlled by Protestants. So the key swing vote was Bohemia, which whoever controlled Bohemia could elect the Holy Roman Emperor. So as I said before, other outside powers closely watched what was going on in Germany. It was a little bit like a vortex, like a swirling, like undertow, and it spun so quickly and powerfully that other countries got sucked into this, and the loser basically was Germany, because it meant that its territory was the base of operations for all these powers trying to complete their objectives. So Ferdinand, who was not at this time the Holy Roman Emperor, but he was a Habsburg who was next in line to become the Holy Roman Emperor if he had the votes, made an agreement with the Bohemian nobles so that he could be elected their king. Basically, he said, I'll respect your religious liberties. They were Hussite Protestants, and so they elected him as their king. So now, theoretically, when the moment came and his father died, he would be elected Holy Roman Emperor because he would control that 4th swing vote. This is just a map of Europe. This is a good thing to know, is just to be able to be familiar with the religious geography of Europe at any particular moment in time. But, after about 1648, it doesn't change a whole lot. All right, so what happened in the first phase, and that's usually how this is treated, as 4 phases. I wouldn't worry too much about memorizing them, but you should be familiar with what countries were entering and exiting, and maybe some of what their motivations were between religious and political and territorial motives. So Ferdinand went back on his promise to recognize the religious liberties of his Bohemian Protestant nobles. So in defiance of him, when 2 administrators of the empire visited Hradčany Castle in Prague, which is the capital of Bohemia, they threw both of them out the window. It's called the defenestration of Prague. They actually survived. They landed in a heap of dung. So the Catholics viewed this as a miracle. The Virgin Mary intervened on their behalf, and the Protestants laughed that they laughed. They landed in a pile of cow manure. So the Bohemian nobles deposed Ferdinand as their king, and they, in his place, elected the Elector of Palatinate, Frederick V, who was a Calvinist. He was also married into the British monarchy, the English monarchy. He's jokingly called the Winter King because his forces were utterly destroyed in 1620 at the Battle of White Mountain, so he was only king for a very short period of time. And more importantly, his electorship of Palatinate was divided between 2 powerful Catholic states, Bavaria, the most powerful southern Catholic state, and Spain, obviously an outside power. And so Ferdinand brought the Counter-Reformation to Bohemia, punishing these Protestant nobles, replacing them with Catholic nobles, confiscating their lands, and bringing in the Jesuits and the Inquisition. Okay, at this point, the conflict becomes even more complicated because Christian IV of Denmark, who's a Lutheran, decides he wants to enter the conflict, both to advance the Lutheran cause and perhaps more importantly, because Denmark is a critical country in the Baltic. The Baltic is the sea that lies between the Scandinavian peninsula and the upper rim of states like Germany, Denmark crosses over, and also Poland and Russia. So this is an important area of trade, things like timber, fish, resin, and amber, and so he wanted to advance his interests in these areas. So he was opposed by the imperial commander Albrecht von Wallenstein. He is an interesting character who's very emblematic of the 30 Years' War. He started out as a Protestant. He converted to Catholicism so that he could gain a position with the Holy Roman Emperor. He was a great military strategist, but he was also a warlord. He basically controlled warfare almost as if it was his personal enterprise as a business. So whenever his troops were operating in an area, he had businesses that supplied them. He made money from that. He treated it almost like it was his own personal army. So it was unclear sometimes what his motivations were, and because he was somewhat untrustworthy, that actually proved his undoing in the end. So Wallenstein succeeded in defeating Christian in battle, and this means at this point it seems like the Catholic powers are about to achieve their objective. And further, the Habsburgs may be on their long-held goal of centralizing Germany through the entity of the Holy Roman Empire. So Ferdinand is so emboldened, he issues the Edict of Restitution, which basically says any lands confiscated from the Catholic Church in 1517 will now revert to the Catholic Church. And this not only angered Protestant nobles who had gained from this confiscation, but even Catholic nobles who feared that the Holy Roman Emperor was getting too much power and was on the verge of centralizing the empire and therefore eliminating a lot of the local traditions and power bases of all the nobility, Protestant or Catholic. So to appease this growing opposition, the emperor dismissed Wallenstein, although he would reinstate him soon, especially after Gustavus Adolphus enters the conflict. So Gustavus is the king of Sweden, which is a country that's fairly decent sized territorially, but only has about 1 million people. Gustavus is a brilliant military leader, introduces a whole bunch of new tactics, which I'll talk about in just a moment, and he is able to revive Protestant fortunes by defeating Catholic forces at the battles of Breitenfeld and Lutzen. Unfortunately for him and the Protestants, he is killed at the Battle of Lutzen in 1631. The advance, however, of Swedish forces continues until it is stopped at the Battle of Nordlingen in the south, which basically kind of influences the religious geography of Germany today. The west and south of Germany is mostly Catholic, and the east and north is mostly Protestant. So at this point, Wallenstein, who'd been reinstated as commander, was engaged in all kinds of personal negotiations with both sides. The emperor told him to not to negotiate, and he continued to pursue his own personal and territorial objectives. And so Ferdinand hired 2 assassins, his own men, to kill Wallenstein. They stabbed him to death, rolled his body in a carpet, and threw it out the door. So that just shows you, again, the complexity of motivations and some of the viciousness of this conflict. So by 1635, no side has completed their objectives, and so most of the German states are pretty much ready to stop fighting. So the German states, including the Holy Roman Emperor, signed the Peace of Prague in 1635, which should have ended the fighting, but it didn't. And now we enter the most complex, most violent, and vicious phase, which is the Franco-Swedish phase. This is where outside powers are clearly just using Germany as a base of operations to complete their own objectives: political, economic, military, territorial. So one of these figures who's very complex is Cardinal Richelieu, who is the main advisor of Louis XIII. And even though he's a prince of the Catholic Church, he supports the Protestant forces, Protestant Germans, and Sweden, which is Lutheran. He does this not because he's primarily motivated by religious belief, but because he's Machiavellian, raison d'etat. What's in the interest of France? So it's in the interest of France to reduce the power of the Habsburgs. France is surrounded by Habsburgs, and so if France wants to break out of that encirclement, it has to support whatever allies will help it. So it's a famous adage of diplomacy: the enemy of my enemy is my friend, which is why the United States and Great Britain were allied with the Soviet Union, a communist entity, during World War II, because we were both fighting the Nazis. So at this point, the war becomes especially destructive as troops who are now finding it's difficult for the powers to pay them because taxes are going up so high, and it's difficult for people to pay taxes. There's destruction of the countryside, so peasants have no money to give any grain or pay any taxes. So oftentimes soldiers will take their pay in the form of torturing peasants, stealing grain and livestock, slaughtering grain and livestock just for the fun of it, raping women, destroying towns. And it's just basically a free-for-all. A good example is the city of Magdeburg, which was taken and retaken several times, sacked by Catholic forces in 1635, where thousands of people were killed. So one of the symbolic values which signals the rise of France as the strongest military power in the continent and the decline of Spain is the Battle of Rocroi in the Spanish Netherlands, where the Spanish are defeated. So after many years of negotiating about negotiations, because each side wanted to win one more victory to improve their position at the negotiating table. So there were many times in 10 years leading up to 1648 where it seemed like the war was over and it continued to drag on a couple more years so somebody could get a little bit more advantage. By the way, the Pope tried to be involved in this but was not. So not only was the conflict important for Europe as a whole, but also for individual countries. So 1648 ends the first period. It is definitely a transformation period. It's a turning point. So in terms of the balance of power, France emerges as the strongest military power on the continent. Sweden would become the largest power in the north, soon to be challenged by Russia. And then even though formally these countries hadn't been independent, they'd been independent in basically fact, and that is the Swiss and the Dutch continue to emerge as a major commercial power in their own right. And then Spain, it's really 1648, not 1588, which marks the decline of Spain. They kind of descend into the lower ranks of, or the second ranks of European powers, beset by internal revolts, tax revolts, surrounded by more powerful neighbors, a crusading mentality, a declining population, a weak economy. And then the Holy Roman Empire still exists until 1806, but it no longer plays the kind of role that it did before. But the Habsburgs still remain powerful because they will turn to the east and begin to gain territory at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. So with the basically de facto death of the Holy Roman Empire, even though it continues to exist formally, you could argue that this is the final nail in the coffin of medieval Europe because the idea of a universal Catholic empire is no longer possible after 1648. Further, this is the last of the religious wars. Religion might play a peripheral role in future wars, but from this point forward, it's mostly politics, diplomacy, economics, which guides warfare. And because of this, the nation-state becomes sovereign over its own internal affairs. So no longer is there really any wars that are to convert other countries to a particular religion, and whole multi-ethnic empires still exist, but they become less important and more peripheral as the medium-sized nation-state like France or England becomes much more the trend of the future. And then in terms of Germany, it's experienced widespread destruction. Maybe upwards of 30 to 35% of its population is killed. Not only that, but whole swaths of territory are basically rendered ineffective for economic activities. Whole towns are wiped off the map. So some would even draw a line between 1648 and the Nazis into the 20th century because this reminded Germans that they're in the center of Europe. They're often the center of conflict over disputes like the Reformation, the religious wars, and surrounded by powerful neighbors. So the only way they can continue to exist is if there's a strong, powerful state which can defend them. So the sort of glorification, idealization of the state, insecurity might in some psychological way kind of set the stage for the Nazis in the 20th century. Some historians also talk about a military revolution, a movement away from heavy mounted warriors and gigantic siege cannons into more flexible infantrymen or foot soldiers, as pictured here. This is a person with a flintlock or matchlock musket, not particularly accurate, probably about 100 paces. You even need a stand to hold it up, and you sometimes maybe have to light something so that it ignites the gunpowder. And you have these infantry squares where they're massed in 3 lines, and then they just take turns firing in what's called a volley, and then they move back, and then the next line comes up. There's also pikemen who carry long spears at the end. And also more flexible and mobile artillery with more light dismounted cavalry who can move these pieces around the battlefield as sees fit, depending on what happens in that particular theater. So the state and the bureaucracy that is part of the state grows bigger because warfare is the most expensive and most complex organizational activity of states. And so basically 80% of budgets go to that. So it sets the stage by both the end of the religious wars and the focus on secular politics and the growth of the state and military power to the development of absolutism. So 1650 and after would be the age of absolutism. So one of the assessments of this from a famous work on the 30 Years' War is that it was morally subversive, economically destructive, socially degrading, confused in its causes, devious in its course, futile in its result. It is the outstanding example in European history of meaningless conflict. I think a good summation of this particular war.